right. Our speaker today is Dr. Peter Mansoor, retired U.S. Army Colonel, and he is the General Raymond E. Mason Jr. Chair of Military History at The Ohio State University. He's also a frequent media commentator on national security affairs. He assumed this position in September 2008 after a 26-year career in the U.S. Army. A 1982 distinguished graduate of the United States Military Academy, Colonel Mansoor served in a variety of commander and staff positions in the United States, Europe, and the Middle East during his military career. In the early 1990s, Colonel Mansoor attended graduate school at The Ohio State University, after which he taught military history at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Colonel Mansoor commanded the 1st Brigade, 1st Armored Division from 2003 to 2005, including 13 months in combat in Iraq from July 2003 to July 2004, service for which his brigade was awarded a President Unit Citation for collective valor in combat. After relinquishing command, Colonel Mansoor resided at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York as a senior military fellow. He then served as the founding director of the U.S. Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he helped to edit the Counterinsurgency Field Manual, which was used to reshape the conduct of the Iraq War. In the fall of 2006, he also served on the Joint Chiefs of Staff Council of Colonels that re-examined the strategy for the war in Iraq. He finished his military service as executive officer to General David Petraeus, the commanding general of multinational force Iraq during the period of the surge in 2007 to 2008. Welcome, Dr. Mansoor.
Well, thanks, Emily, and it's great to be back with you. I see your digs have improved here, especially the view it's wonderful. So we have 40 minutes, and I'm going to leave most of the time for question and answers, because I'm sure you have many. It was originally scheduled for me to talk about Ukraine, but given the events of the last 2.5 weeks, I suggested that we expand that to Gaza as well. So we'll talk about both. So first on Ukraine. Now, I made the prediction last time I was with you that Ukraine would win this war, and I still hold to that. But it's going to be a long slog. It's kind of surprised me that Ukraine has not broken through and gained more ground back in their counteroffensive against the Russians. And the reason is the Russians have adapted on the battlefield. I didn't think they would. I thought their leadership was really poor. But in Russian military history, they are tenacious in defense. So if you've ever studied World War II, and heard about the Battle of Kursk, the Russians built 7 different layers of defense, all with extensive minefields and anti-tank traps, and they were able to stop the Germans cold in their offensive in July 1943. And the same thing has occurred here now in Ukraine. Even though the battlefield is much more extensive than the Kursk salient, the Russians have sown millions and millions and millions of mines. And despite all of the technology of the day, clearing mines there's not a lot of new technology for that. It has to be done the old-fashioned way, and or else you lose a lot of people. And Ukraine can't afford to lose a lot of people, so they've been going very slow in terms of attacking and clearing these minefields as they go forward. They have been gaining ground, but like I said, the process is slow, and this has devolved now into a war of attrition, at least in the near term. They have had other successes. They've hit the Russian naval forces in Crimea with drones and with missiles and other weapons, and actually forced the Russians to withdraw their ships from Crimea and move them to a base further away. The United States has now delivered ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System, to Ukraine, which has a much longer range than any of their previous weapons. So they're able to reach out further into the Russian rear areas to hit supply centers and command and control nodes and artillery, and that has helped as well. But they don't have a lot of those systems yet, and that will take some time. Of course, they have been offered F-16s, which our allies in NATO are providing, and we will backfill those F-16s with F-35s. But it's going to take a while to train up the pilots. That's not a quick procedure. And so this is going to go now into the winter months and beyond. Right now, the fighting is somewhat at a standstill because we are in the period called in Russian, the Rasputitsa, literally the mud period. And mobility has been circumscribed because of the rains. The fighting will go on once the ground freezes in the winter, and I think this will be a multi-year conflict. It already is, 20 months or so. But remember that the Iran-Iraq War took 8 years. And even then, it wouldn't have stopped except for some various interventions by the United States and the international community. So this is going to be a long conflict. Now, why do I think Ukraine is going to win? Because they have to. They won't give up their sovereignty and agree to a peace treaty with Russia. The only kind of peace treaty that Putin would accept is one that makes Ukraine subservient to Russia. And so neither side is willing to give in. That could change. There could be a wild card event. Putin could get assassinated. I doubt it. You know, the Ukrainians could somehow decide that losing all this manpower isn't worth it. I doubt it, because they are literally fighting for their existence. So this war is going to go on. But with our help and with NATO's help, I think Ukraine can win. Now, our help is essential. And we can't give them help unless we have a Speaker of the House. And then, you know, there is a bipartisan coalition that wants to provide aid to Ukraine, and President Biden has wrapped this up with a package to provide aid to both Ukraine and Israel to make it more palatable to the right. But we got to make sure, or not we, but Congress has to make sure that the folks that don't want to give aid to Ukraine aren't able to stop the passage of the bill that a majority of Congress supports. And this is always a tricky thing in Congress with its arcane rules about who can stop what. Right now, we have a senator from Alabama who's put a hold on all military promotions above the rank of colonel because he disagrees with the Biden administration's abortion policy of allowing service members to travel to other states to have abortions, which affects about a dozen or 2 dozen people a year. But for that, there are now 500 to 800 military officers awaiting promotion to the rank of general and above who can't get promoted because Tommy Tuberville won't allow it. And these are things that affect our national security. And the issue with Ukraine and Israel is now caught up in this morass. And hopefully we'll have a House Speaker this week and we can get beyond it. All right, so that's Ukraine. Let's go to Gaza. On October 7th, militants from Hamas crossed the border into Israel. Israel has border defenses that they thought would prevent this from happening. In the previous years, the big issue was tunnels. Hamas would tunnel under the border and then pop up. And Israel had worked hard to shut down those tunnels, figure out where they are. But Hamas got quite creative. They came in greater force this time. They used paragliders to fly over the border. They used bulldozers to basically cave in the border fence. And they were able to get into southern Israel and invade kibbutzes and music festivals and other places with a goal, with 2 goals, really. One, they wanted to capture as many people as they could because hostages are worth a lot. in terms of what you can get for them, whether it's prisoner releases or other political goals. And they wanted to kill a lot of people to shock the world. This is what terrorism is all about. Their political goal is to destroy Israel. So if you're pro-Hamas, that's a legitimate political goal, and that is not unusual in war for one side to destroy the other. But in terms of the methods they use, they're clearly terrorist methods. Terrorism is the deliberate targeting of non-combatants in order to create shock value, and that's what they did. They went across, killed a lot of people, raped women, took about 220 hostages back to Gaza. And they're treating the hostages pretty well. Why not? I mean, the hostages are your capital. So on CNN this morning, by the way, how many saw me on CNN the last couple of days? None of you watch CNN. I was on with Wolf Blitzer on Sunday, and I was on with Anderson Cooper twice yesterday. All right. The problem with having a public email address is that I appear on CNN and all of a sudden I get this flood of emails from around the country saying, you didn't say this, or you didn't, you're pro this, or you. Hey, I'm just telling it like it is from my viewpoint. So they're treating the hostages pretty well. They're providing medical care and so forth, because despite the horror of their attack, they're trying to convince the world that they're really good people, and they want the hostages to survive because, like I said, they can trade them for various things, and I think that's why they've released about 4 of them in the last few days. They've released the ones that are probably too sick to survive extended captivity, and they'll have this dribble of people that they release while they continue to try to get various things diplomatically, whether it's the release of hostages. Now they're trying to barter for fuel to come back into Gaza because Israel has shut off the supply of fuel, water, and food. Israel really has a stranglehold over the Gaza Strip. The problem for Israel is if it goes too far in this, it's going to be seen in the same light as Hamas, deliberate targeting of the Palestinian people in order to get at their enemy. And there's already, in terms of numbers, there were 1,400 Israelis killed in the initial attack, and since about 3,300 wounded. In retaliation, Israel has begun airstrikes against Hamas targets, but of course, Hamas targets equals a lot of civilians in the area as well. And there have been 5,000 Palestinian deaths and 15,000 injured, and that number is going to go up. Prime Minister Netanyahu has promised the eradication of Hamas. That is a goal that I believe is not possible. Israel says this is our 9/11, a terrorist attack that killed a lot of people, and now they have to respond. But in exacting revenge, they need to look at our experience with our response to 9/11. Our response was to invade Afghanistan to destroy Al-Qaeda and kick the Taliban out of power for supporting Al-Qaeda. And how'd that turn out? The President Bush, when he was in a meeting of his war cabinet before the invasion, they went over the military plan, and then he said, so who's going to run Afghanistan after we win? And he got a bunch of stares back at him from the table, and no one had a clue. Wow. And this is the same thing that is a warning to Israel. Even if they go in with a ground invasion, which they probably will in a matter of days, even if they're successful, who's going to run the Gaza Strip when they're done? If they just withdraw, Hamas will come back into power, because the latest polling shows that about 65% of the residents in Gaza support Hamas. So what do you do then? you can't govern Hamas yourself. If you do, you're in our situation in Afghanistan, where 20 years later, the Taliban are now back in power. And so Israel needs to think hard about the end game here in the long term. Because just going in and exacting revenge might make you feel good, but you're going to lose world opinion. That's now firmly on Israel's side. And if you recall back to the day after 9/11, every nation on earth, with the exception of two, was on the side of the United States. Fast forward 3 or 4 years, and almost every nation in the world was against us because of our invasion of Iraq, which they saw as they didn't think we had a reason to do it, which I would agree with them. So Israel needs to think now about, what are we going to do if we go in with ground forces? What's the end game here? And the end game is the hardest part. My boss, General Petraeus, once famously said, "How does this end?" But it's the key question. How does this end? My belief is it's got to end with a diplomatic solution. The Palestinians desperately need some measure of political sovereignty in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then for their part, the Palestinians need to recognize the right of Israel to exist. And those two things are easily said and really hard to accomplish because of Israeli politics right now. The settlers are, and their political movements are some of Benjamin Netanyahu's strongest supporters, and they don't want to see a Palestinian state on the West Bank. They could care less about Gaza. And on the Palestinian side, there are quite a few Palestinians who have it as their goal to destroy Israel, and they don't care how long it takes. I mean, you think back to the Crusader states, they were in power for 200 years, but eventually the Muslims came back. And this is kind of the long-term mindset of a lot of people in that part of the world. So talking peace is easy, but getting it done is really, really hard. And I'll end there and take your questions. I think we have about 22 minutes, right? Okay.
Talk about the role of drones and how that's changed the strategy.
The role of drones and how that has changed strategy. Drones have become one of the most important technological tools in warfare today, both for reconnaissance and now for striking targets. And the next step you'll see is air-to-air combat between drones. This is following the progression of manned flight in World War I. First, it was used for reconnaissance, and then someone figured out you could take a grenade and drop it on the enemy trench, and then someone figured out, oh, I can take a pistol and shoot at the enemy pilot while I'm flying. And then they figured out how to strap machine guns on the plane, and it went from there. Every part of manned flight you're going to see with drones. Strategic bombing, transport aircraft are going to be drones in the future. Probably have pilots when you have people in the plane, or at least a pilot as a backup, but you're going to see autonomous aircraft soon. And this has caused, it's hard to mass forces, like you mass a lot of tanks together to launch an attack, and a swarm of drones will come overhead and either hit the tanks or they will see where they are, and then an artillery strike will come. This has made anti-drone defense a priority, and the U.S. Army has actually developed systems to shoot down drones. There's, I think, 3 of these truck-mounted systems in every combat brigade now, and we're giving them to Ukraine. So this is part of the action, reaction, counteraction of warfare. But drones are here to stay, and they are an integral part of combat operations today.
Talking about endgame, and I apologize if you said this, what is Putin's endgame with Ukraine, assuming he went? Is he looking to make it another Belarus? Or is he looking to bring it into Russia somehow, sort of a non-communist SSR?
he believes he can outlast us, for one thing. He thinks our will collapse, and you can, you can see that in the polling. When the attack first came, Americans were about 60% plus for providing aid to Ukraine. That number has dropped now to around 52%, something like that. In Congress, it's greater because I think they have a wider view on the world and the importance of backing Ukraine. So he thinks he can win. And so if he does, portions of Ukraine will be annexed. He's already annexed 4 provinces. He doesn't control them all, but he's annexed. And the rest of it, he would want to see go the route of Belarus with a friendly government that does his bidding. And
You mentioned bulldozers in the Gaza. You mentioned bulldozers in the Gaza. I guess I'll call it war at this point. How did they not detect that kind of approach?
yeah, the Israelis are having a come to Jesus meeting. Can I say that? over their intelligence failure on this. They believed that their technological systems plus their human intelligence would warn them of any big thing like this, and it completely failed. So the answer is I don't know, but the Israelis will have many commissions, and they will trot out the usual suspects and hang them from the yardarm in response to this failure, and they'll figure it out. But we got to give credit to Hamas. For as brutal as they are, they're crafty, they're well trained. There are reports on the news this morning that the hostages that were released when they were in the tunnels saw these mock-ups of the kibbutzes. So the Hamas militants actually rehearsed what they were going to do, which is exactly what the U.S. Army does. We create mock-ups and then we rehearse. And so you got to give Hamas some credit. They're capable. They're a capable military force for the amount of people and weaponry that they have. Just be thankful they don't have more weaponry. But this is what I didn't mention, the role of Iran. A lot of what they have comes from Iran. Iran is the backer of both Hamas and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And the great danger here is that Iran convinces Hezbollah to intervene in the conflict, creating a second front for Israel. Could Israel handle it? They would probably go into Gaza with ground troops and use air power to target Hamas. But Hezbollah. But Hezbollah has 130,000 missiles trained on Israel. And the Iron Dome system, their air defense system, would be overwhelmed by that number of rockets. And I don't know where that ends. Israel is a nuclear power. They may decide to launch a nuke against Tehran and say, you stop your proxies from attacking us because our people are being slaughtered, or Tehran goes down in flames or nuclear ash. This is not a great situation for the Middle East. It's why we have 2 carrier battle groups in the Eastern Med to try to convince Iran as a deterrent, don't go there. And the Secretary of Defense actually said that, don't go there. Yeah.
This is inside baseball, but one of my assignments when I was in the Army was in the MFO in the Sinai. And so we have troops in the Sinai with an observer mission there. There's obviously UN peacekeepers in the Golan Heights. I think they're still there. Why did the observer missions not detect there was a problem, a buildup of troops? And 2, what's our role in those multinational forces to ensure that some of this could be, calmed down?
Yeah, we have about a battalion at any given time, about 500 to 800 troops in the Sinai. They are along the border between Egypt and Israel. The attack came from the Gazan border with Israel.
Yeah, that's Sector D, as I recall.
Yeah, so they wouldn't have able to detect anything. They're there, by the way, as part of the Camp David Accords, which made peace between Israel and Egypt. But to monitor the border, there's this battalion of U.S. forces there. I'm not sure that the UN still has a mission in the Golan Heights. I'd have to look that up.
Just curious.
Yeah, me too.
How do you think the weapons, the large weapons get into Gaza Strip? It's basically quarantined. It's got a fence around it, it's got security, the waters are being monitored by the Israeli Coast Guard. How do they get the missiles and large weapons in?
Through border crossings with Egypt and I don't know. I mean, they may sneak them in over the water as well. Israel recently struck Damascus Airport. Now, why would they strike Damascus Airport? Because Syria is not part of this conflict. Because that is the transport portal for weapons coming from Iran. They land in Damascus and then get shipped out from there either by air or by ground. They find their ways. There's tunnels that they can use to get under the border with Egypt. And like I said, I don't know about whether they're getting any in through the Mediterranean Sea. It's a many miles of coastline you have to protect and make it 100% foolproof. But clearly they get weapons in because Hamas has launched, I think, 6,000 plus rockets at Israel now.
We have a question online. I'm sorry, I'm
Oh,
behind.
over there.
I know.
Oh, I'm sorry. I am deaf in one ear.
Oh.
And when you're deaf in one ear, you have no sense of direction. Noise comes. And it's why you have two ears instead of just one in the middle of the because it allows you to triangulate the noise of the sound.
Sorry about that. So how many casualties have the Ukraine sustained? What is the number of military age Ukrainians available to fight? Information by percentages would also be helpful.
I don't know. There is an app called Google, though. Probably has that answer. I could look it up, but I don't. If someone wants to look it up, we'll
I'll answer it.
in the back there.
Recently, an old term has been heard again, the arsenal of democracy. Could you comment on how prepared the United States is logistically?
Yeah, it's a great question because we have been grown accustomed to wars that are short, high tech, with boutique, exquisite weapon systems. And what we found out in the Ukraine-Russian conflict, there's still a place for lots and lots of artillery rounds. And when we're supplying these artillery rounds to Ukraine, they're coming out of our stockpiles, not out of current production. We have discovered that our current production is woefully inadequate to a war on this scale. And so there is a long-term plan that Congress and the administration have amazingly agreed on to ramp up our artillery production, but it's going to take several years to get it to a point where it can provide the means for Ukraine to, to have the amount of artillery rounds it needs. So we have had, an epiphany that mass still matters in modern warfare and that we need to ramp up our defense industrial base. So yes, we still are the arsenal of democracy, but we are the arsenal of democracy in 1939, not the arsenal of democracy in 1943. You could follow up.
To pick on artillery, I believe you have written that the biggest advantage the American forces in Europe had over the German forces was our ability to control and mass artillery. You can talk about what the current state of artillery is, both in Gaza and in Ukraine.
The Ukrainians have a lot of artillery, a lot of different artillery systems because every nation that gives them an artillery system has a different system. So they're really working with a wide variety of artillery systems, but they're managing it. They're making it work. And they have enough systems. They don't have enough long-range systems, so the ATACMS are one that we just gave them. But what they really need are the ammunition to go in them. They just don't have enough. Neither do the Russians, by the way. That's why the Russians are reaching out to the North Koreans. North Korea has some of the best and longest ranged artillery in the world. They have a lot of it. And so they're trying to get North Korea to supply them with artillery ammunition. This is an artillery war. You know, we thought maybe by giving Ukraine a lot of high-tech weapons, they could overcome the Russians, and they did the first 20 months. But that's good for defense. For offense, you need lots of artillery to plow the ground in front of you, destroy those minefields as you move forward, and it just takes mass.
What is the role of Qatar and the Emirates and Oman and the straits along the Persian Gulf?
Yeah, so the Gulf states and other Arab nations, Jordan, are trying to intervene diplomatically. Right now, they're working on some sort of deal to try to get the hostages released, and whether that's a prisoner swap or some sort of prisoner swap plus humanitarian aid to Gaza, I don't know. But this is a lot of hostages. Remember that way back about 10 years ago, there was an Israeli soldier who had been taken prisoner by Hezbollah. It took 5 years to get him released. And it took the release of about 200 or 300. Well, I forget the number. It might have been even more than that. A lot of militants out of Israeli jails to get this one person back. Now you have 220 people. Hamas is going to, their price is going to be high. And we'll see how that goes. Over here.
Yes, what's happens between Israel and the Palestinians reminds me of the United States and the Native American Indians, and that you have a treaty, and then the settlers would cross the line, and there'd be fights and deaths, and the line would move further west until the Indians were in an area that they weren't a problem anymore. It doesn't seem like that's going to work for Israel.
Yeah, you're talking about the settlements, right? So Palestinians rightly view the settlements as a slow motion takeover of their land. And if you want a two-state solution, there's got to be land available to create a Palestinian state. And right now, a lot of that land is being gobbled up by these settlements. It is the number one impediment right now to peace. So, and that doesn't mean there would be peace if the settlement activity stopped. There's a lot of other things that have to occur. Palestinians have to recognize they're not going to win this war in the long term and have to agree to that Israel is going to stay. And for the Israelis part, they got to realize there's going to be a Palestinian state next to them. And I'm reminded of a trip I took in 2008 when I was newly retired from the military, and the Israelis invited me over. They wanted to kind of pick my brain on what had worked in the Iraq war and with the surge. And I said, the number one lesson is you got to find willing partners in the enemy camp to deal with. For us, it was the awakening movement against the tribal revolt against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Famously, the British deputy commander of multinational force Iraq, Sir Graham Lamb, said, harking back to his time in Northern Ireland, he told General Petraeus, you know, you're trying to make peace with the wrong people. You're talking to people who are already on your side. You make peace with your enemies, not with your friends. So we need to reach out to the insurgents and figure out, you know, how do we get them to stop fighting and support a political way ahead. And this was my lesson to the Israelis. You got to find people within the Palestinian camp who are willing to deal with you, or willing to, you know, barter and talk diplomacy and figure out what the shape of peace solution would look like. And these were all IDF people in the room, and they basically said, well, that's not possible with the Palestinians. What else do you have for us? You know, and so they're all about these tactics, techniques, and procedures. and not about the big idea, which is separate the reconcilables from the irreconcilables and deal with the reconcilables to fashion a diplomatic solution.
To add on to the last question about those settlements, like Bethlehem and Jericho, Bethlehem being just on the steps of Jerusalem there, how do you see all of this has happened mainly on the West Bank and Gaza for years and continue now? How do you see that affecting Bethlehem specifically right there by Jerusalem, but also other settlements throughout Israel?
I couldn't say, I don't have that kind of granularity on various settlements. My family was from Ramallah originally, so I do know what's going on there because I still have a contact there, and that's now the capital of the Palestinian Authority. And there's a lot of development there. I mean, you look at Ramallah, it's a modern city. You know, I think the solution is you create a Palestinian state on the West Bank, and whatever Israeli settlements are there can remain, but they become part of Palestine and give the settlers dual citizenship. You know, that's an idea.
We have another question online. I'm sorry. So first off, she wanted to comment that she wants to make sure that people understand that the villages and kibbutzim that were attacked have been there since the 1950s. And she also wanted to ask, can he please speculate on why there is such a high percentage of Palestinians that support Hamas? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the Palestinians, they've now been exiled from what they consider their homeland since 1948. And they've been promised peace for so long that they're just tired of hearing it. And so they're all for backing a group that has as its goal the destruction of Israel. You know, on one hand, I can't blame them because, you know, their conditions are horrible. They live in Gaza, they live in an open air prison. Israel has blockaded everything. You got to give these people some hope if you want this conflict to end. And to me, that's a measure of political sovereignty and then a sort of a Marshall Plan for Palestine to improve their economy. But I'm reminded of what John Paul Vann, a U.S. advisor in Vietnam, once said about security. He said, I don't know if security is 90% of the equation or security is 10% of the equation, but I do know that security is the first 90% or the first 10% of the equation. So without security, everything else will collapse, no matter how much money you pour into the place. I think we proved that in Afghanistan. You've asked one, so back there.
Can you imagine any way that it could be feasible to get fuel into the hospital in Gaza?
Israel's got to allow it because they have the stranglehold on the border. And right now they're blocking fuel in an attempt to get the hostages released. They'll say, we'll provide fuel if you release the hostages. And there was a plan, one of the Emiratis negotiated to release 50 hostages to get fuel into the Gaza Strip, and Israel rejected it. They said all the hostages or none of them. So that's why they're holding up the fuel.
I hate to bring this up in the context of starting with a humorous one, but we've all seen Bill Murray try to get rid of the groundhogs in the golf course. And we know how that didn't work out. Now, that's a bad entry, but the tunnels under Gaza are so many and so deeply embedded that the only way to take away the hiding places is to try to conquer that. And that's a monumental task given the number of mines and indiscriminate killing of everybody around. And that's what worries me when we talk about Syria is right nearby and they didn't mind using chemical biological weapons on their own citizenry. And Putin, in a desperate move, might reach for something less desirable yet. And something that, because all the mutual assured destruction weapons kill everything and everybody. They don't have any differentiation, whether chemical, biological, or nuclear. the land is useless, the people are gone, and I don't know, do we think that Hamas in their frustration and anger would go to that length with the backing of Syria and Iran and all these states, or do we think that they also understand that mutually assured destruction are words that really mean something?
I don't think Hamas has chemical weapons, so, but I don't have access to intelligence, so I don't think that's a huge issue. The bigger problem is a problem for the Israelis, right? They feel the need to respond to this attack. Greatest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust. So they feel they need to go in with ground forces, and yet going in with ground forces is going to be counterproductive on almost every score, other than that of doing something, right, in response to this horrific attack. But it's going to kill a lot of Palestinians. The world opinion is not going to be on their side anymore. They're going to have a lot of Israeli soldiers who are killed in the process. So it's going to kill more of their citizens, and it's not going to solve the long-term political issue. And, you know, you kind of feel for them. They feel this need to do something. And yet, if they do something, it makes matters worse.
Yeah.
You know, I would like to think there's a future where they don't launch a ground invasion, that they say, okay, we've killed 5,000 of your citizens. Now let's negotiate the release of the hostages, and let's talk what it would take to get you to the negotiating table for a peace treaty. That would be the best of all worlds. But I think in Israeli mind, that's giving in to what Hamas has done and rewarding them for this attack.
Yeah.
So I just don't see it. I think a ground invasion is going to come, but I think strategically it's the wrong move for them. I think we're done. One more.
One more question?
Excuse me, you said that you think Ukraine can still win this situation. How do we know when it's won? What's it gonna look like?
What does win look like?
I mean, what if Ukraine wins?
Yeah.
What do they win?
They're gonna, what they need is for Russia to decide that Ukraine can exist. And that's a hard thing to earn, but the alternative, you know, people, and there are elements of the US Congress who say, well, we need to get them to the negotiating table and they just need to make peace with Putin. They can't, because Putin's price is the elimination of Ukraine as an independent state. This is why I think Ukraine is going to win, because they have to win. And they're going to stay in this conflict as long as they can. And you know, someone once came up to Adam Smith talking about the continental system in the Napoleonic era, and they said, "But sir, the continental system will be the ruin of our nation." And Adam Smith replied, the great economist, "But sir, there is a lot of ruin in a nation." And this is the case here in Ukraine. Ukraine will fight tooth and nail to the end to make sure that they survive. And so it is survival for them means that Russia decides never again to invade Ukraine. And that means the defeat of the Russian armed forces. And then the building up of the Ukrainian armed forces such that Russia isn't going to decide to invade again. And it may eventually mean that they become part of NATO, because if they become part of NATO, they now have the nuclear umbrella from France, Great Britain, and the United States over their heads. This is, like I said, this is going to take many years to play out. But I don't see it ending any other way unless Russia wins. And then that's catastrophe for the West.
That means that all the Russian troops and people that are occupying parts of Ukraine now are back in Russia. Gone.
If Ukraine wins,
Yes.
yes, it means Ukraine regains sovereignty over their land. Because if the war just stabilizes now along the current front line, and there's no peace treaty, then you just have a frozen conflict, which Putin is good at. And you have conflict you have like the same thing as what's happened in the Korean Peninsula now, between North and South, a militarized border and no peace.
Is there any new information about Putin's health?
I don't know, but let's say he dies today, who would replace him?
That's the question.
Probably one of his cronies who would act just like him. You know, the idea that Russia is going to become a parliamentary democracy anytime soon, I think is pretty far-fetched. They tried that in the 1990s and it collapsed pretty quickly. Yeah, under Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, there was a democracy of sorts there, and until Putin took over and he created a dictatorship again under the guise of a democracy.